All right, this is good. Glad we were able to delay a little bit given the parking situation and all that. But thank you guys. Thank you so much for being here. This is our 9th Coffee and Conversation, our penultimate, if you prefer that term. And today we are very gratified to have with us Dr. Michael Clamann, yes, who formerly, and I think I'll say this rather gleefully, I'm sorry, but formerly was with Duke's Human and Autonomy Lab, but as of Tuesday, I understand is going to be with us here at HSRC. So my apologies in advance. But no, it's wonderful for you to join us and our team. And she's sort of going to be opening up the human factors element of the work that we do. So it's really exciting to see where Michael takes this. But just a little background on Michael. Yes, formerly of the Duke Human and Autonomy Lab, working with the interaction between sort of robotics and human realms. As a background in mechanical and industrial engineering, as well as experimental psychology, which is fascinating, sort of lends itself to the human factors world, and had gotten these degrees at NC State. Well done. That's essentially what engineers do around here. And has worked in the sector for any number of years now, about 16 years it seems, in terms of working with governmental entities and corporate entities, working on aviation and telecommunications, things of that nature. So but without further ado, I just want to introduce Dr. Michael Clamann.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and sorry to those of you on that side of the room. I have to sit here to advance the slides. One of the things that I've been working on for the past couple of years, so in addition to the research that I've done for the Humans and Autonomy Lab on looking at the interaction between people, operators of systems with advanced automation, like driverless cars, running some of those studies, I've also been working exploring policy issues regarding autonomous vehicles and a number of other types of robotic systems. So I'm going to kind of use a number of different elements of my background, talking about some of the technology, talking about policy, talking about some of the social issues having to do with driverless cars. All these kind of combine together into one of my favorite topics, which is the topic of how safe is safe enough for driverless cars. Thank you, Robin. All right. And what I mean by that is one of the questions that comes up is that with driverless cars, one of the things that is supposedly going to happen is that it's going to address the 94% of fatalities that happen because of human error. And so the idea is that by replacing the human driver with a computer, that you can eliminate that human error. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of times, you're just trading one problem for another. And so as we start transitioning from one technology to another, there are going to be some benefits, but there's also going to be introduced a new set of problems. And so one of the questions that we have to answer is, at what point in the technology's development is it time to go ahead and release these? And so I'm not going to finish this talk with an answer to that question, because I don't completely know the answer myself. I'm going to set it up with the background so we can have that conversation among ourselves. So I'm going to try to talk for 20 to 30 minutes, lay out a landscape for all the issues that I see at a fairly high level, and then leave it all to the group of us to discuss the topic. So I'm going to be talking about the technology. I'll talk about the policy, and then some of the social issues about these things. I love this picture because it's super adorable, and she's incredibly happy in her car and just seems oblivious to all the different things that are going on. Okay, so in order to start the talk, I want to describe the terminology that surrounds autonomous vehicles. And to do that, I need to talk about the so-called SAE driving levels. So I know that this is probably a review for a lot of people, but bear with me. I'll put in a few new items here as well. Okay, so the SAE driving levels. This is something that NHTSA uses, that Senate and Congress use to describe the levels of automation for autonomous vehicles. And it goes from level 0 up to level 5. Okay, so level 0 is essentially, that's a car with no automation whatsoever. And these are pretty rare at this point. You'd have to get an older car, maybe be fortunate enough to get a 1973 Falcon if you're going to have something like that. So because most modern cars that you have right now have some kind of automated assistance, whether it's stability control or analog brakes or something along those lines. And that's what you would describe as a level 1 vehicle. That is a modern car that if you're going to buy something off the lot right now that provides some additional safety features. When you move up to level 2, that's when you start getting a little bit more obvious assistance with the driving task. That's when you start seeing things like steering, acceleration, and deceleration assistance. That's when you start seeing something like the Tesla and its so-called autopilot. One thing to make clear, Tesla autopilot, that's not an autonomous car, even though I think when we see some of the accidents with that Tesla's had, there's been some talk that this is an autonomous car, or looking at the new Cadillac system, the new Super Cruise. These are not autonomous systems. These are systems where the driver is still responsible for driving the car in most situations and required to pay attention. When we start getting up to what's called the so-called highly automated vehicles or autonomous cars, that's when we start getting to level 3. I don't have an example of a level 3 car because these don't really exist quite yet. The best parallel for this one, I think, is an airplane's autopilot. So this is a system where the human operator, the pilot, the driver, is engaged periodically. So you might make a few changes to the system, set some kind of a coordinate or something, and then sit back and watch the show. So in this one, the person, the driver, is ultimately responsible for maintaining his or her own safety or the safety of the passengers. So basically the car is doing all the driving, but if something goes wrong, then the driver has to step in and do something about it. And this comes with a great deal of controversy because this is something that people are just inherently bad at. We suffer from something called the vigilance decrement. Anytime we are paying attention to something for more than about 20 minutes or so, we tend to tune out. And there's really nothing that we can do about it. This is just something that we naturally do, that we see in security systems. Basically, anytime you're paying attention to something for a long period of time, you're gonna tune out. Like I said, this is something that we see in aviation systems. We see it in rail transportation. One thing to point out, so one of the discussions is that systems like these are supposed to bring down human error, but when you have systems like this and things like aviation, you still have about 70-80% of your accidents are because of human error. In rail transportation, it's about 75%. When you start looking at other areas where people are supposed to pay attention to things that are going on, something like cybersecurity, you're moving up to like 90%. So in systems where there are a lot of computers involved and the systems are doing things for you and supposedly keeping you a little bit safer, there's still a large element of human error in those. It doesn't necessarily go away. So basically just to say, automation for automation's sake, like this type of system, it's not a cure-all. And there needs to be a focus on making sure the automation is designed with the users in mind carefully so you can eliminate some of these, or at least accommodate some of these issues. Okay, moving up to something a bit more positive. This is a level 4 driverless car. This is one that for the most part drives itself in many conditions. And one example of how this would work is you would actually drive the car, say, from your driveway to the highway. You would press the autonomous button, your seat would move back, steering wheel kind of moves back, and then the car would drive on the highway safely until you get to your exit ramp, and then it would return control to you. So the idea is that it can completely take care of the driving task in certain conditions. So ideally, while you're in this position, you're never going to be asked to drive. All right, moving up from level 4. You get to level 5, we're back to the Google car. This is a car that can drive under all conditions, no matter what. There's no steering wheel, there's no gas pedal. The car does everything for you. So this is essentially the goal in many cases for driverless cars. Okay. And so this gets back to the grid that we have. This is the summary of the SAE driving levels. And I'm just going to focus, this is the area that I was talking about right here. You can see as you start moving from the low driving levels up to the higher ones, the human driver is responsible for less and less, and the system is responsible for more and more. So level 5, the computer does everything. At level 0, the human does everything, and then you've got kind of these nebulous areas in the middle where the human's doing some and the system is doing others. All right. And again, as I mentioned, anytime there's legislation or rulemaking for autonomous vehicles, whether it's NHTSA, whether it's Congress, whether it's the Senate, they tend to refer to these as well. Okay, so in general, just a summary of this. This is where, as you move from level 0 to level 2, and then again to level 3 to level 5, you've got the difference in terminology is for highly automated vehicles. So when we talk about autonomous cars, we're talking about level 3 and higher. And as I was mentioning before, when you're looking at level 3 and maybe level 4 versus level 5, you're kind of looking at this question of deployment of, is the technology ready? So can the level 4 and level 5 cars drive in all circumstances that they need to, without error, without causing an accident? Or if it's a level 3, is there an effective human-centered design that allows you to safely make that transition between the human driver and the car itself? So I'm going to focus more today on talking about the technology aspect of it, just in the interest of time. I could spend probably an afternoon talking about the human factors of transitioning back and forth between the car and the human. Okay, so since we're just talking about the technology, this is a very general overview of what we're looking at, of how a driverless car works. So basically it takes its inputs the same way that we would, through some kind of a vision system, through its sensors. This can be LiDAR, radar, ultrasonic, cameras. Generally, autonomous vehicles have an entire suite of different sensors that they use, and each one of them have their own strengths and weaknesses. And for example, LiDAR is extremely high resolution, but it doesn't do well in bad weather. Radar works under almost all conditions, but it's very low resolution. It's just good for telling distances to large objects. So what the manufacturers tend to do is just bring large groups of these together and look at the big picture by combining these. And that combination is referred to as sensor fusion. This is where you take all of the inputs from your different sensors, you process them together to find out what is it that you're seeing. Is it a pedestrian? Is it another car? Is it the edge of the road? And then you take that information, you combine that with where you are. So the car has a sense of where it is because chances are it's already mapped to the area, and it knows what is in the environment. It takes all that information together, and it makes some kind of an analysis as to what to do, and then it actually executes the controls. So we're taking all its inputs, think about it, combine that with where they are, make decisions about the path, and then actually execute it. So it's not that much unlike, it's very analogous to how a human being could drive. And typically, you're going to see one of two different types of errors if something does go wrong. So either something's going to go wrong with this works, yeah. Something's going to go wrong with one of the sensors. It's not going to pick up something. It's not going to work. It's just not going to perceive the actual event or the object. Or there's some kind of a novel situation that the car wasn't programmed to handle, and it's not going to know how to respond. So one of those two things is typically going to be what's going to happen. So the difference between, one of the big differences between a human driver and the autonomous car is that the programmer has to figure out all these things in advance. So rather than if there's an emergency situation, we kind of react spontaneously to what's going on. If a autonomous car is going to react to a situation, some programmer at some point would have had to account for that situation in some respect. So that puts a fairly big burden on the programmers for doing this. It means that there are countless situations that they need to figure out how they're going to plan for it and how they're actually going to address it. So that's one of the things that makes testing the autonomous vehicles fairly challenging. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about in a few minutes as well. Okay, so this is kind of where the development is right now, and all of the various OEMs and technology companies, they're kind of doing this on their own. All right, moving on to government oversight of this. So right now, it's kind of the Wild West of development for autonomous vehicles, because the government isn't really doing much about it. They're kind of taking a wait-and-see approach. So in any kind of technology-led legislation like this, the government can either go with a precautionary approach, where they say, we don't know what's going on, we need to slow down, we need to legislate what's going on here, or more of a permissive approach. Let's let the market handle it, and let's let the technology unfold and see what's going on. So right now, the U.S. government is taking this more permissive approach. They're kind of not putting a whole lot of constraints on the car companies, and they're just letting them develop. And if you look at, so this is the cover page of the NHTSA's Vision for Safety. This is the rulemaking that they released toward the end of last year. Some of you starting to see Russell Hanneman up there. Yeah. That's my edition. Okay. It's not actually on their side, and thank you for noticing that. So anyway, the first version of Vision for Safety, so the NHTSA's rulemaking on autonomous vehicles, was about 126 pages long, 116 pages long. This one is 26 pages long. So it's gone from something that was already very difficult to write and didn't have a whole lot of specifics to something that has even fewer. And it reads almost to me like a marketing, like an advertisement than it does any kind of a rulemaking. So, and everything, again and again, if you go through a Vision for Safety, you'll see on literally almost every page, it emphasizes that they are recommendations and suggestions. There's no enforcement going in here. So it just talks about things like recommending that automakers release safety memos that include, 12 different points having to do with, things like system safety, cybersecurity, and that sort of thing. And the same thing is happening right now in Congress and in the Senate. So right now, the congressional bill, I think, passed almost unanimously. And then the Senate AV START Act is kind of being held up right now for a number of different reasons. One of them is that it doesn't include commercial transportation. And then I think there was some debate, again, basically the Senate bill calls for a lot of committees. It calls for observing what's going on. It recommends, actually it says that every car manufacturer has to release a safety memo describing the process. But it says that that won't have any effect on whether or not the cars will get released or not. So it's something they have to produce, but there are no repercussions stated within the bill. At one point earlier this year, Dianne Feinstein was sounding an alarm, saying there's no consumer advocacy in there. There's no real point. There are no points about safety within the AV START Act. And maybe we should have something. She wanted to take more of a cautionary approach to it. And then a week later was when the Uber car test vehicle struck and killed a pedestrian in Arizona. I haven't heard it much since then at the Senate level, but the timing on that one was fairly grim as well. Okay, and again, I think as we know, at the state level, we see a number of different approaches to this. So since the federal government isn't doing much, a lot of the states are doing their own legislation, and you see a lot of variation in how strict they are. So California is fairly restrictive. They require the disengagement reports. Everyone has to register with the California DMV, although at this point I think there's well into the 50s of cars who are registered there. Then you have, on the opposite extreme, you have a place like Arizona where there's an executive order that says you just come on in and do whatever you want, with places like North Carolina kind of falling in the middle. We have legislation right now that just says there's a law for fully autonomous vehicles, basically the completely functional level 5 that can operate under all circumstances, but there isn't really anything else other than that. Okay, so given that, how are they testing? So right now there's a number of different approaches that the vehicle manufacturers are taking to testing, and we're seeing you see a number of these in the news, and they range in the permissiveness of the car companies. So it goes from putting them on closed test tracks with professional drivers. You've got on-road data collection with professional drivers, and that's a lot of what you see with the cars being tested in places like Philadelphia, Mountain View, California, and Arizona with Google and Uber. Then you've got on-road data collection with actual customers under controlled conditions. This was an interesting idea that Volvo had that they were going to start doing last year, where they were going to give 100 SUVs out to a select group of customers in Gothenburg, Sweden. And these were people who were going to be driving this particular well-mapped highway that was out there. And so the idea is that they would all have a level 4 autonomous vehicle. They would drive it out to the highway. They would take it to work or wherever they needed to go. And it would have this fully autonomous capability when it's on the highway. But Volvo was very proud of this. They made a lot of announcements. They said that they were going to do this first in Sweden, then they were going to do it in Beijing, they were going to do it in London and one other city. And then all of a sudden, toward the end of last year, they decided, no, we're not ready for this, and they delayed the entire test for about 4 years. Just to show there's still a lot of challenges and a lot of kinks to work out in some of these technologies. And then the last one that we see is the idea of doing on-road data collection with consumers just because they agree to terms and conditions. And this is essentially what Tesla's doing right now with their autopilot system. So in addition to them using this autopilot on the highway at the same time, it's doing a lot of data collection on how the autopilot's being used, that when the car is shut down and plugged in to recharge for the night, all the data goes back to the server. So this is generally what's happening. There's also this idea that a lot of these companies are also using simulations alongside this as another test method. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But one of the things I think that people can that a lot of these companies are proud of is the number of miles that they've driven in proving their cars. I think Google is up to like 4 million miles at this point. But I think, as we know, the 4 million, which is fantastic, pretty much pales in comparison to the actual number of miles that we drive on an annual basis as a country. And so that 4 million, I think, is something like that's what 400 people would do for about 8 months, right? So not really indicative of all the different conditions that we might be able to drive under. And again, all these the roads that they're driving on, these are very well-maintained roads in places like Arizona, places like California, and not necessarily, like the rural roads that I drive on to come into work every day. So it's not necessarily going to really establish the safety for these vehicles across all types of conditions. Okay. And so that's brought up a few other folks that have looked into that exact issue. Can we drive our way to safety by testing? And Rand Corporation, Needy Colorado and Susan Paddock did a study a couple of years ago that basically said no. There's really no way that we have the resources to be able to demonstrate this, that you'd have to drive hundreds of millions of miles and we still wouldn't even know. And that's even under the most aggressive test circumstances, where it would take basically hundreds of years, depending on the level of fidelity that you wanted to be able to establish this. So being able to do all these test drives as the only means of making sure these cars are safe, it's not going to work. But this doesn't stop, some people from, coming out with these bold statements about, how their cars are reliable based on the testing that they've done. This is something that we see again and again from folks like Elon Musk, who say that their cars are safe, even though a technology like autopilot is only meant to work under circumstances where we have a lower incidence of traffic crashes. So well-marked highways with bright lane markings is where autopilot works. Basically what Elon does when he quotes his statistics is that he takes the autopilot statistics of where accidents happen when autopilot is engaged, and he compares those to the entire population of traffic accidents. So it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison. Okay, so these are the approaches that are recommended by researchers who are in the field. This is a list that I got from the University of Michigan for some research they did. So they advocate a combination of a number of different test methods, from the naturalistic field operational test, which is what we were just discussing. Another one would be to use a test matrix. And so this would be something like imagining a number of different scenarios that you would use to test the cars against. So can the car drive on one-way streets in an urban location? Can it effectively drive in a rural location at 45 miles an hour? Can drive in mountains and rains and so forth. So basically coming up with an exhaustive list of test scenarios and making sure that the car can do all of those. Another one that gets kind of into the system safety literature: imagine the worst thing that can happen and make sure the car can do that. This is one of the areas, this is where the trolley problem comes up. If you guys have heard this, the whole idea if an autonomous car is driving and it's either going to hit the back of a truck and kill the driver, or you can veer to the side and hit a school bus, or veer to the other side and hit a group of nuns. So making a near impossible decision. But this is where you kind of, if the car had gotten into a situation like that, something went horribly wrong somewhere upstream, so design that out of the system. And then the last one is simulation. So take these same situations, do your field tests, create your test matrix and or your worst case scenario, and rerun these thousands and thousands of times in a simulation to see how the car reacts. Again, I'm sure most of the people in this room know a simulation is only good as the data that you put into it. So the simulation, in order to be effective, has to account for all the different possibilities in order for it to actually test what you want it to test. So this is definitely something that needs to be done, but it is a huge challenge. And regardless of what you do here, something's bound to slip through. We're only going to be able to be so comprehensive if we, as I was saying, you're not going to see every possible situation with any of these. So no matter what, there's still going to be some things that we can think about when the cars are actually deployed. And this is another thing that researchers have considered. This is another report that came out of Rand Corporation, where they were showing that as we deploy autonomous vehicles, it might be okay that they're not completely safe. So what this graph is showing, and you can actually go and play with these numbers at the Rand website, is if we deploy autonomous vehicles as soon as possible, then having them on the roads is actually going to accelerate the technology. So the more that we have them, the faster that we're going to develop them, the faster that they're going to be improved. So say, for example, we go ahead and deploy them when they're just as safe as human drivers. So we continue on the verge of about 40,000 fatalities per year, where there's a combination of those fatalities come from autonomous vehicles and from human drivers. Okay, so lots of people are getting killed. But the sooner we do that, the sooner the technology improves, and the sooner we actually make improvements, or we have this reduction in fatalities. So although in the short term, we're going to continue to see a lot of people getting killed on the road, in the long run, we could save hundreds of thousands of lives. So it's a very utilitarian argument where it looks at, in the long run, we're going to save more people by introducing them sooner. There's also some scenarios you can run using the same data, where even if they are less safe, So if we even increase, fatalities with autonomous vehicles in the short run, in the long run, we still save a lot more lives. Again, on paper, that looks great. But then we start to get into this whole ethical argument. So that is, as I mentioned, that's a very utilitarian argument. I've heard this many, many times when I talk to engineers. This is what we want to go for. That we're going for the greater good. We're going to have a sacrifice of a few people, but in the long run, this is going to be everybody's going to be better off. But that also brings into conflict this whole idea of respect for persons. So utilitarianism, statistically makes sense, but then who are those people going to be? Is it going to be, my daughter as I'm driving her to school, who, is going to be a little bit less safe? Are we going to be able, so I can make decisions as an individual for my own safety. I mean, I don't drive at 1 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Eve because I know that that's not a very safe time to be doing that. I don't get to make those same decisions anymore when it's an autonomous vehicle. But there are ideas, there are opinions about both of these. So again, getting back to Tesla, is that we don't want to take this away because we're doing a disservice to people in the future. And if you talk to someone who's been affected, by a drunk driver, or by a careless driver, then this argument makes a whole lot of sense. But then on the flip side, there is this worry that if we go this route, then we may unfortunately kind of taint people's ideas of the safety of driverless cars, and we may not actually allow them. So there's this there's a quote in the memo that went out a couple of years ago that some of you may have heard about this big caution about artificial intelligence, taking over the world, that was signed by people like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking and so forth. But there's a great quote inside their research article that says, if you have autonomous vehicles and you cut fatalities in half, take it down from 40,000 to 20,000, you're not going to get 20,000 thank you letters, you're going to have 20,000 lawsuits. Something like that may actually, affect the release of these. So the point of this being, we need to be careful about being too hasty about this, because you may actually make people afraid of the technology and limit the release. Okay, last thing. This is something that I wrestle with. So as engineers, we have a code of ethics that we're supposed to adhere to. And that code of ethics includes the fact that we hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. And when we think about that previous slide, the whole idea of utilitarianism versus individual autonomy, what does this mean in terms of autonomous cars? What does safety mean when you start thinking about a system like an autonomous vehicle? And so the idea here is the cost that we incur acceptable? My personal opinion on this one is that there are a number of practices that we have in place for ensuring things are safe. And while certainly things could happen, it's up to us to do the best job possible of making sure that these are safe. So if you know that there are problems with people using automation for extended periods, with aviation, with military systems, and so forth, take those same practices, take those same test methods that you use with those, and apply those to autonomous vehicles. And if you look at things like the accidents that happen with Tesla and with Uber, you can see for certain those engineers, the people who designed those vehicles, did not take those same considerations into account when they were designing this, because anyone who's worked in the aviation industry pretty much saw those accidents coming. That those are dangerous systems, and something like that was bound to happen. So, on less of a grim note, this is one of the things that I like most about the development of autonomous vehicles, is that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. It's not like we're suddenly going to take all the cars that we have off the road at one point and we're all going to be driving autonomous vehicles. The technology that we're developing on the way to AVs is giving us a lot of great systems right now. And this research is going into things that are being developed into cars now. So I think one of the things that we're going to see on the way is that cars are going to be safer and safer and safer as we learn more about how these autonomous vehicles work. So I think we're going to see this nice trickle down of technology as we move towards this. And maybe it could be a while before autonomous vehicles come, but I think we're going to start seeing the benefits, and we already have to a great degree. So that, again, is a lot all at once. But that generally, like I said, that gives us kind of a landscape. There's a lot of things I didn't say, a lot of other topics. But now I want to just open it up to questions, and I'm very interested in everyone's opinions about how long should we wait until we release these, and what should we be waiting for? I'm also happy to answer any questions anybody has about this.
On that slide where you showed the human-driven linear trend versus the automated vehicle one, that still looked like an upward linear trend even with automated vehicles. Do you think that's an accurate model for that?
So they didn't really explain in a huge amount of detail everything that went into that model. I think that it assumes an increase in population. So.
Do you know if they've looked at, or if any research, I haven't come across it yet, have looked at mixed traffic sort of situations where you have different varying levels of automation, advanced driver assistance systems, and its effect on safety?
Well, I think that's one of the things that we're seeing kind of unfolding in the real world. Okay. That the autonomous vehicles, at least initially, had a higher incidence of crashes, but not because they were crashing, it's because they were being hit by other vehicles. So I don't know what other, and this is because, it's actually a good point to make, is that autonomous vehicles don't drive like us yet. They're very precise, they're very logical, and one of the things that would happen is that when there's a green light, for us, for example, we tend to kind of inch forward and check to see if there's any traffic that's coming the other way, and then we accelerate through the light. The Google car would pause when the light turned green and then go. And so people would, because they were inching forward, they would bump into the backs of the Google cars until Google figured this out and started making some accommodations to it. So I would say, yes, I'm sure there are studies, but like you, I haven't read any specifically. I know it's something that, I'm very interested in also, and I think I've seen a couple of RFPs go out about that topic, but I haven't seen the results of the research yet.
Hey, Michael, this is Nancy. This is all really informative and a great presentation. One of the questions, I don't know if it's a question or more just a comment, is, as we're in this period between, more technology but not fully quite automated, my parents have a newer Subaru which has just about every safety feature available on it, and driving that thing is so distracting. Because every 2 seconds there seems to be some kind of warning about something coming up, and I just wonder if you have any comment on, maybe some of these safety features are making us less safe because they're so distracting.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and that goes into this is a well understood issue that comes from decades of designing things like power plants, where if you have warnings and alarms that go off, and they go off all the time, people start ignoring them. And I think in a lot of cases with these new features, I know I can't speak to Subaru, I can speak a little bit to Honda, that I know that their lane assist, many people turn it off because it's too precise. So if you start to move outside the center line of your lane, it beeps at you, it gives you a warning to tell you, you're about to go out. But it happens so often that it just becomes, it becomes annoying, and people just don't want to deal with it anymore. And yeah, I would attribute that to, that just requires more human factors testing to figure out what that threshold is. This gets back to a concept, called automation, referred to as automation trust. And you need to find this threshold. It's a difficult thing to do, but you need to find the sweet spot of understanding where the technology works for you. So in the case that you're talking about with the Subaru, these alarms go off too often, and so you turn them off because you don't believe them anymore. But on the flip side, you can get to an overtrust issue where you always believe the automation and you stop paying attention to yourself on your own, and that way if something goes wrong, you no longer understand what's going on and you can't address the problem. So the best way is you want to design these warnings for that sweet spot that's kind of in between. This is actually a study that we're doing right now, or my former colleagues at Duke are doing right now, and we're investigating that exact issue with pedestrian warnings. So if you had an app that would try to warn you for stepping out in the street into traffic, if you were distracted by texting or watching Netflix or something like that, are you going to pay attention to those warnings over time if they are 100% reliable versus if they're not completely reliable? So yes, and the answer to your question is it's a problem. It requires more human factors testing to figure out what that sweet spot is. It's just that technology is so young right now that I don't think people quite figured out what that sweet spot is.
Yeah, my old pickup was stick shift and it had a light to tell you when to downshift or feel it coming. It took me about 3 weeks till I had a white piece of electrical tape over that.
Yeah, can you speak a little bit more to where things stand with the technology being able to detect pedestrian activity like in an urbanized area where there's so much going on, or bicyclists as well, and how it can...
Yeah.
Are we even getting close to solving that issue, or is it still just a big problem?
The way you phrased it is the challenge. Are we close to solving it? I'm going to say no. I think solving it is an incredibly difficult problem. We're getting better, for certain. Mobileye, in particular, has been working on this for a while. I mean, right now, for the most part, those are, I think it's using radar and cameras for pedestrian detection. And something like detecting a pedestrian that is walking right in front of the vehicle when there's no other visual noise around, that's easy. That's something that the car can definitely do. It's when you start, it's the scale of the problem where it becomes difficult. So when you're driving in an urban environment, there's a crowd of people on the side of the road trying to figure out how the car is going to react to that. That becomes a much bigger problem. So right now, pedestrian detection is done by identifying, basically picking out that item that I see in the environment that is a pedestrian, and then figuring out what is that pedestrian doing. That's done by comparing the pedestrian's profile to a massive database, essentially, of other pedestrian likenesses, and then labeling that as a pedestrian, and then also looking at where's the pedestrian moving. So one of the problems is every car company or every technology company that's doing this is doing it differently. So where the challenge comes in is that, so it's very easy to see me right now because there's nothing in front of me, and you can tell this is what a pedestrian looks like. But if I'm being blocked by something, now I'm identified as something else potentially. My understanding, I think that they're still doing some investigation on this, but that's what happened with the Uber fatality. So for whatever reason, that pedestrian wasn't identified as a pedestrian. Again, this isn't what happened, but as an example, if your database is looking for a pedestrian, basically looking at 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, and you have somebody who's pushing a bicycle that's loaded down with a bunch of bags, which was the case here, that may not match up with anything in the database, and it might get missed. So it's something, we're making good strides towards pedestrian detection, but it's an extremely complicated problem. It's going to take a while to figure it out right. A lot of these things, people also talk about how they're doing gesture detection, trying to read body language and things like that to figure out where the pedestrian is going. We are very far away from that being reliable. We're bad at doing that already as humans, and asking the machine to do it is a huge challenge. Yeah.
I think these are related questions, but maybe different words. But so I'm thinking particularly back on your point on the Elon Musk quote about 40,000, 20,000 deaths, and the particular moral and context for that. So I'm thinking about also occupational injuries. We've got 5,000 as occupational injuries a year, and those are happening often, with machines involved, machines that don't have the same level of standard we already are seeing, potentially in an automated vehicle. So the different context for where we, and the standards we have in different contexts, that question sort of generally about that. And then thinking back to opioid work, which I do work around, so for predictive analytics, showing a provider, a risk score, people we've talked to have been very hesitant to use those kinds of techniques because whose legal responsibility ultimately will it be when it becomes a mutual decision about the human should have put the brakes on to see that the human. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about, again, those two pieces, sort of the context-specific part of our trusting machines, and the legal part.
Yeah. So the first one, there was a really good observation. I want to unpack on this one. Was there a specific question in there, or do you just want to? Are you talking about the difference between industrial safety and this environment?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm wondering, how you all are thinking about it in the automated vehicle space, because it's coming up in a lot of other spaces too. Just what standards we maintain in interactions with police, in a physician setting, and standards are different in different settings. And how are you all thinking about it specific to automation?
Yeah, so you bring up a very interesting point, and it's something that I think about a lot. So my background is in industrial engineering, and my last degree was sponsored by NIOSH. So my focus was on industrial safety. And so when I consider autonomous vehicles, that's the standpoint that I come from. So when you're designing a safe system in an industrial location, basically the concept of an injury or fatality is completely unacceptable. So if you have that opportunity, then you redesign your system so that that can't happen. And there's a whole hierarchy that you work from for doing that. From the most useless thing that you can do is put up a sign warning somebody, don't do that, because people ignore signs anyway. But that's within the whole range of things you can do. That's the last step. The best thing that you can do is eliminate the hazard. So if you have a system that causes that has the potential to injure somebody, is there a way to just remove that completely? And if you can't remove it completely or make an improvement so it doesn't exist, then is there something that you can do to interrupt the pathway between the person and that? Can you separate them from harm? For example, and this is what you do in robotic systems, is basically you create cages so people don't get close to them. Anyway, so that's just in general, in industrial safety, what you do is that you just separate them completely. So when I look, that's where my training comes from. So when I take that approach and I look at traffic, that's a very difficult concept. So I remember I was in a room with about 40 people. This was talking about pedestrian safety, and we were talking about this issue of when you have driverless cars and you're in a crowd, say a concert's let out, a sporting event, or whatever in an urban location, and you've got pedestrians who are just crossing the street, in droves in front of cars, and you're trying to get out. I think a lot of us have been in this situation. It's a challenging one to get through because in these cases, a lot of people are breaking the law all at once. And if an autonomous car is programmed, as they are right now, to just stop when it sees a pedestrian, pedestrians are going to know this, and they're just going to walk in front of the cars because the cars are going to stop, and basically the autonomous vehicles aren't going to move anymore. So anyway, I'm in a room full of researchers, and we're talking about this particular problem. And this one researcher who has been doing this kind of work since longer probably than I've been alive, he says that we need to, if you're in that situation, the car needs to just keep kind of inching forward and push its way through the crowd. And I'm thinking, children have died in escalators because of stuff like that. If somebody gets jammed under a wheel and the car is programmed to keep moving under all circumstances, somebody eventually is going to get injured or killed in that kind of situation. And so there's the difference between the industrial safety approach and the non-industrial safety approach. And I don't have a specific answer, but I think they are two different approaches. I think that there's some overlap between the two, but yeah, I think some of those folks are talking more and more. I'm fascinated personally by that overlap because I haven't really seen it that much. When I bring these points up in places like TRB, I feel kind of like a foreigner saying some of these things. But I do believe that a lot of these approaches can also apply. Again, I'm not so naive to think that you can bring, you can absolutely, eliminate every possible hazard from driving. I mean, that would be kind of ridiculous. We would just stop at that point. So. And then going to the second point, can you repeat what you were saying about the opioid issue?
Yeah, I mean, and on the first, I'm thinking about something like meatpacking injuries. Things that are happening behind closed doors versus things that are happening. Our expectations for machine safety in the public space versus in more like behind, potentially undocumented worker injuries. So just the visibility of these kinds of injuries, I think, probably changes that context too. But the second one was just the legality of making decisions with a computer. In this space, when should the human have intervened versus when should the machine have intervened? And,
that's one. I mean, that is very. Just as an engineer, that's very difficult to prove. it's very hard, and people talk about this kind of stuff all the time. It's like, oh, a person would have seen that. A person would have done something about that. Oh, a computer would have seen that. And that's, I mean, I think that's mostly garbage. And we saw that again with Uber. Like, it had LiDAR, it had radar, it had cameras. It was a fairly well-lit area. There's no reason why it wouldn't have seen that pedestrian. So for some reason, the car didn't. I think going back and trying to figure out what would have happened in those situations is, I don't know, I mean, it's a bit of armchair quarterbacking. It's very difficult to do. And I'm not sure there's a way, again, in my experience, I'm not sure there's a reliable way to do that other than in the aviation field, what you do is if there is a incident or an accident in an airplane, they put that exact same scenario into a simulator, and they'll have a number of pilots reproduce it and find out what would have happened if they had done that. And I think that addresses some of those elements, but you know, it takes some of the pressure out of it as well. So it doesn't have the same level of fidelity. But anyway, it's a long answer. So
well,
I don't
huge
know.
question. I don't know. It's great. Thank you so much. Who do you sue? I mean,
yeah.
Going back to the graph that showed the number of fatalities for the two scenarios, with and without automation, did that study have any information about the type of crashes that may be reduced due to automation, and the type of crash that may increase due to automation?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to say, honestly, I don't know, but I don't think so. I think they were looking at much more broader numbers, but no, that's a good point. And that's something, I've had that conversation a few times too, because what you're going to see is, you know, that autonomous vehicles are going to be better than most drivers. You know, it's going to address things like distracted driving, drunk driving, fatigue driving. So those are some of the things that are going to be addressed. But then it starts to get into this, you know, is it better than a teenage driver or is it better than an elderly driver? That's when it starts to get kind of fuzzy. So I don't know the answer. It's a great article. They do go into some detail on how they did it. I mean, I can send the URL around if anybody wants.
Have there been other studies on the same topic?
Sorry?
Have there been other studies on the topic?
Yes, I don't know any off the top of my head, but I know that particular RAND report did inspire a number of other studies, and they cited other ones as well for theirs. That was probably just one of the best known.
Thank you.
Yeah, Laura.
So you gave a really nice landscape of the different ways that these vehicles are being tested and some of the rulemaking and policy making. I was just curious what you feel like, you know, within the testing and the policy making, what are the biggest triggers for opportunities to think about unintended consequences and the ethical issues that you raise?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Where are there within the testing and within the policy making? What do you think is going to trigger us to think about the unintended consequences? Is it just we wait till a crash happens and then we think about what should have happened?
Yeah,
or
I do.
Can we build it into our testing to really think about the unintended consequences that have happened? So
yeah, I think I might be a little cynical about it, but I don't think anything's going to really change unless people are forced to change on this one. And I think there was like this huge amount of optimism, at least I look at how the trajectory has kind of changed over the past 2 years. I remember watching a Senate panel 2 years ago where the Senate panel was a number of different representatives from the automotive industry and then, you know, Missy Cummings there. And everyone on the panel except Missy is talking about, you know, this broad optimism about how perfect everything is going to be. Then a year later, there was a very similar panel. I don't remember everyone who was on it, but I remember Gil Pratt from Toyota was there. And a year later, there was a lot more tempered approach to it. People weren't quite as optimistic. There was more discussion about, you know, the limitations of autonomous vehicles. So I think more and more education is getting out there, but I think there is still a lot of, I mean, if you look at any articles, I mean, there's still a lot of hype. I think people are becoming more and more reasonable, and the voices of people, warning us about the dangers of autonomous vehicles are being heard more and more. But I think it may also be because of these events. Unfortunately. I mean, I think if there's a way to do education, it's completely worthwhile. But I know, you know, it's been a while since I did it, but when I would try to contribute to online forums about some of these issues, I would almost always get shouted down about being a naysayer. But then again, that's online.
The internet, sorry.
Okay, so there's a a theory out there called safety compensation, whereas if I'm in a safer car, or I know my vehicle is bigger and can withstand an impact, I'm likely to drive faster or take less precautions. And so whether that's totally true or not, has that kind of idea been factored into the autonomous vehicle? Whereas, say if I'm a pedestrian and I see an AV vehicle coming at me, I can separate out in front of it because I know it's going to stop and use less caution as maybe a pedestrian or as another driver.
Yes, that has definitely been brought up. And one of the areas where that is affecting is in how we show that a vehicle is autonomous. As we talk about, the whole research about mixed fleet, that's definitely brought up. If you know that a car is autonomous, over time we're going to start gaming it. Like if you want to merge into it and there's not enough space, but it's an autonomous car, you might take some chances if you know how the car is going to behave, if you know if it's always going to react the same way each time. Or if you're a pedestrian and you see that an autonomous car is coming and it's going to swerve or it's going to brake, and if it sees you, you may start gaming the system. And this is why some automobile manufacturers are saying they don't want to mark their cars as being driverless so they don't miss out on this kind of thing. So yes, that is definitely a concern, and this gets back to one of the conversations that I had about if everyone else knows how they can manipulate the results or the behaviors of an autonomous vehicle, they're going to start gaming the system, and it could actually create congestion. It could stop the car. So yes, that's definitely a potential issue. You have a question also?
When I first ever heard at all about that they're actually working on self-driving cars, the way that I envisioned it was going to be was that I was like, oh, how is that going to work? How are they going to know where to go? And I envisioned the solution that I came up with when I was young was, oh, they're going to change the roads and they're going to put sensors in it. The cars can follow these. And I never then thought that they would actually be driving with cameras and vision and looking around. And a lot of the solutions to the problems we're talking about seem to be completely trying to make the technology fit the way that things are now without changing the infrastructure or the way that driving and transportation is done, as a whole. And so, when you talk about, the concert, if it's getting out. Well, one solution is the car can stop completely, but it'll never go anywhere, or it can inch forward, without ever stopping. That's also a problem. And it seems that there's a third way where the driver just takes over at that point.
Yes.
Right. Because presumably the car is driving on the road because someone's using its gas somewhere. And again, when you're talking about the different stages we're at, the 0, now we're at stage 1. And there are a couple Teslas at stage 2. And it seems like all this research is going into how do we get stage 5 to work without a whole lot. I'm sure it's going on, but you don't hear it very much we're trying to solve the problems of stage 3. We're trying to solve the problems of stage 4 and implement that. So it seems I'm just wondering why, is it because we don't hear about it in the news, or are people, again, basically expectations are higher for technology, but it seems like our expectations are set completely at perfection for something that hasn't even been done at all yet, rather than expectations, even if they are for perfection, for something that is more achievable right now.
Yeah. So you bring up a lot of really good points. So I'm going to address the levels of automation thing first. There are different manufacturers are working on different aspects. There's actually a lot of people who believe that a level 5 vehicle is completely impossible. And you bring up a really good example, because if you might get into the situation where a vehicle just isn't going to be able to make those decisions safely, and so you need to have a person take control. And so that might be an example of a level 4 car. And there's also, the possibility, so these cars are going to have problems, just like cars have problems now. Sensors are going to go bad, things are going to come up. And if that does happen, you need to have a way of getting the car out of the situation. And so there's a number of different ways of looking at it. One is like what you just described, that maybe just go ahead and give the control to the driver/operator and let them get it out. Another one is talking about remote dispatch centers, where someone could actually remotely control the car and get it to a better fallback position where it could then keep going. So there's a number of ways of looking into it. There are some companies that are looking, going towards the level 4 cars. They think that's the best way to go, and that's what they're trying to address. There are some people some other companies who are looking at level 3 who would like to create that car, who think that it's a good idea. Right now, I can't remember what the name of it, traffic assist. Audi is doing something where they want to have a level 3 car that works below 30 miles an hour. So if you are stuck in traffic, downtown Los Angeles, or on I-40 in the morning out here, that if you're going under a certain speed, which is incredibly tedious, the car could just do that for you. And perhaps at a low enough speed that could be safe. Again, I personally advocate for just don't do level 3 at all. It's a terrible idea, and people are definitely going to get killed. It's the way that we do. It's the way we run airplanes, but essentially our margins for making decisions when something goes wrong in an airplane are vastly different. I mean, you're talking about minutes or longer in an airplane versus split seconds in a car. And so having that transition between a person taking over in a bad situation in a car is it's probably not a good idea at this point. Trying to get back, the first thing that you were talking about, you made a really good point, and now I've lost it. What was the first thing that you were saying?
About how we're trying to make the technology perfect for the environment without changing the environment.
So that's, again, you're actually touching on one of my favorite topics with autonomous vehicles, is that we're essentially, this is normal in technology evolution, but it's fairly short-sighted. That we're basically taking a computer and we're dropping in the driving seat. Dropping in the driver's seat. We're looking at the driving task from a very human perspective. We want the computer to see like us, we want it to hear like us, we want it to see the same road signs that were designed 100 years ago, for our own perceptual deficiencies, right? And that's okay in the short term, and it makes sense from a cost standpoint because infrastructure is incredibly expensive. So there's a lot of people out there who work in law and work in policy who say that we're never going to get infrastructure improvements for autonomous vehicles because they're just way too expensive. But to me, the only way that we're going to realize the full benefits of autonomous vehicles is if we have those infrastructure benefits. Because right now, we're asking computers to act like people. But they're two very different systems. There's certain things that people are good at, and there's certain things that computers are good at. And right now, we're asking, the computers to kind of work with one hand tied behind their back because we're asking them to see like people. If they could see like computers, that's when we could actually fully realize the benefits of it. So there is a lot of research out there. It's called V2X, vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to vehicle. So the vehicle can communicate with its environment electronically. And there are a number of people working on that right now. And that, again, is how we probably realize the full benefits. But in order to do that in practice, we're going to have to figure out how we're going to pay for all that stuff. Okay. Yes?
You're saying what are the full benefits of autonomy?
So I'm going to give you an analogy because I don't know. So when we first, back in the late 90s, when we first started using the internet, and a lot of companies were starting to move, we're starting to get a web presence, that there was this big push, I want to be on the internet. And what they would do is that they would take their print catalogs and they would just reproduce them on the web. And we saw this for years, that basically people were taking the exact same thing they were doing. They would have nice splash pages and basically recreate billboards and catalogs online. So they were taking basically, this is the way we do things right now. We're just going to do this on a different medium. And it was starting around the early 2000s where we started seeing things like social media and other things where we just started doing things on the internet that we didn't even think about before, that we couldn't do, but it took that kind of evolution and having it in practice to be able to see what we actually could do. And now there's things, who would have thought, of Twitter in 1996, right? That's kind of where I would see it going. If there's something, I don't know what's going to happen, but until we actually do it and start having the full technology deployment, we're not really going to know. It's going to be something I would imagine pretty cool, but until we actually start releasing it, we're not really going to know.
Given time, I think we'll have to wrap this up for everyone's time. But you want to join me in thanking Dr. Those reflection sheets. Many of you do. Many of you do not. It looks like. Take a minute to fill those out. It's okay.